Hey everyone, this is Raymond, your co-host on the Front Porch Philosophers podcast. Thanks for listening to today's episode. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and follow us on Twitter at Philosophy Porch for live updates about future content. You can check us out on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, and Google Play. You can also become a founding member of our podcast by going to patreon.com/fpphilosophers, where you can support our show, get access to our blog, and learn more about the host of the Front Porch Philosophers podcast. Thanks for listening.
Welcome back to the Front Porch Philosophers podcast. My name is Tom Stewart Farmer, joined as always by my co-host Michael Granado.
What's happening?
And Raymond Perrier.
How's it going?
Another late night edition, at least for those on the East Coast.
The late night edition.
Is that your best attempt at like a Barry White?
No, that's my late night radio personality. Hello and welcome to the Front Porch Philosophers.
Does that personality have a name?
Magnus.
Magnus?
Of course. What? Nice. Okay. Well, the topic for today is superheroes and fascism. So, is there a connection between these two things? I mentioned this connection in a previous episode long ago when we said we were going to talk about it, and we're just now getting around to it. I don't necessarily want to defend the thesis that superheroes lead to fascism or that superheroes are an example of fascism.
Because it's dumb.
But that critique of at least certain superheroes or certain renditions of certain superheroes is at least out there. So I think is an interesting topic to discuss, even if we can't say anything to defend. First off, you can't say anything definitive because these are stories, right? They're not. They're subject
I would
to
say
interpretation.
They're myths.
Well, I could go along with that. Yeah, there's a mythos surrounding the canon of superheroes. So, if we're going to say that there is or there is not some connection between superheroes and fascism, it's probably worth our time defining what we mean by fascism. So, Raymond, you have some ideas about what that means, right?
So with regards to the superhero world, you typically hear people talking about fascist ideals like might equals right. The strongest person, is the one who ultimately has the decision of what happens for everybody, which then is followed by this sort of typical idea that only the select few should dictate the fate of the world. We should protect the status quo. But if we get to a more broad-reaching definition, we're just going to go ahead and say that it is generally understood, fascism is generally understood as far right-wing authoritarian, ultranationalism that is usually defined through, or at least understood through, a dictator. And it comes in the form of propaganda machines. It comes in the form of the suppression of people who disagree with them. And so, but it takes a little bit of it's a little bit of a turn when it gets, casted into the superhero world. There's not necessarily this idea of nationalism. So I think what people really throw back on when it comes to the superhero world is the issue of authoritarianism or totalitarianism with that added, spice of violence that ends up enforcing the status quo or reinforcing the status quo. So that's where I think we should hover, because it's not really going to fit the form of fascism that we know through Nazi Germany and through Mussolini and Stalinism and all of those things. But it does still have the major element that people hate, which is the authoritarian, violent, reality of, the superhero world.
Yeah, really quickly, let me interject and go on a slight tantrum about little history here. So if you're interested in fascism, if you're interested in studying like the origins and the roots of fascism, The idea of fascism really takes hold in the 20th century. The 20th century was very, very tumultuous time in terms of political ideology, in terms of political thought, especially with the advent of World War II. World War II saw, after World War I, actually, you saw the downfall of monarchies in Europe. And to fill that void, you saw the rise of kind of what I would call like strongmen politicians. People like Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, and Joseph Stalin. These very strong figures that stepped into their political economy at the time and who garnered a lot of support, and as a result had a lot of people put their faith and support in these people because of the belief that these men could single-handedly deliver them from their current situation. And to me, like when I think of fascism, that is the primary example that I think of. You have these states such as Germany after World War I, which is economically speaking, just destroyed. I mean, hyperinflation to the max. And you have someone like Adolf Hitler who offers people a reason for why Germany is in that state and a solution to get out of it. And as a result, people just give him the right of way to do whatever it is that he sees fit.
Yeah, his answer for why the state is because Jews, and his response is get rid of the Jews.
Exactly.
There's a lot of scapegoating in that kind of strongman politics then and now. And you may be wondering, like, what does this have to do with my favorite superhero? I don't see a connection between these two things. Well, these sort of strongmen only really arise in a breakdown in society in some regard, right?
Yes.
There's some sort of power vacuum, and then they step into the void, and they typically consolidate power into themselves, right? Into a singular personality, and they become the arbiter of what justice is. So think of Batman in Gotham City. So this is the connection. There are lots of different ways. There are lots of different versions of Batman. There's a lot of different ways to read Batman. I understand all that. But this connection comes down to this. So the state of Gotham City, in some iterations of Batman, has become so crime-ridden that the politicians are corrupt. The police are either ineffectual or they are also corrupt. And so no one, is there to defend truth and justice and whatnot. So who steps in but a billionaire armed to the teeth with military-grade weapons, and he goes around exacting justice as he sees fit, right? So this sort of vigilantism, then he becomes the hero of the city because he can do what the democratically elected officials cannot do, right? Which is to clean up Gotham. And, if he does it by force, then that's, either something that we just have to accept, or it may be even in some cases applauded, right? That he's doing what the justice system can't. But it goes without saying that in this country and in lots of other countries, this history of vigilantism is essentially a form of domestic terrorism, right? You find people that the justice system either cannot deal with or refuses to deal with, or in some cases are innocent, and then you have a mob of people or individuals decide that they will become the arbiters of justice, to take it upon themselves to exact revenge on behalf of society. And we don't typically, we don't typically praise those people, or at least I don't think we should. And so there's enough of a whiff of that in the Batman canon to say, hold up here, what exactly are we inculcating in this sort of anti-hero story?
And Jared, I just want to throw on top of this some comments about Batman and his use of surveillance that rivals the NSA. He has a tank. He's flying around the city, at his own will. I mean, he's doing all of these crazy things that we would never accept. and it's just because he's some millionaire playboy and people will just trust him. There's always this, issue now, you think of it in real terms, like the practicality of a lot of these heroes. You would never accept that in real life, and yet we entertain the ideas on the television screen or in a comic book. And I think the question is, why do we care so much? And it gets back to that old adage that, life imitates art, art imitates life. And that possibility that these things inspire people to think, well, we need to find a Superman or a Batman or a Tony Stark who can come in and bail us out and save the day. And and that becomes the scapegoat, right? Like we end up trying to solve problems by giving power to everybody else. And that's the issue. So that's why people write about this. Like every time a new superhero movie comes out, there's some journalist or blog person who's going to write something up about it, which is why we decided to weigh in on the subject.
Which, granted, some of these are written some of these think pieces are pretty ham-fisted, and they are clearly written by people who don't care about comic books,
Right.
and they're so that level of cultural critique, I understand the pushback from actual comic fans that says that these stories are a lot more nuanced than this, especially recent iterations of. I'm going to keep bringing up Batman here. Recent iterations of Batman actually pose these, at least implicitly, these moral questions about what Batman is doing in the form of other characters, right? So, say in The Dark Knight,
And I am one of those comic book fans that gets pissed off when people kind of talk about superheroes are really fascist. It's like, really, like, what comic have you read recently that supports your point? But I do think that there's something there, and sticking with Batman, and at the same time defending Batman. So Batman as a vigilante is accepted because Batman's vigilantism corresponds to our view of justice. And you see this with, Batman's origin stories. This shouldn't be a spoiler for anybody because it's been covered in probably 8 different films.
it's like a 90-year-old character.
It's Bruce Wayne, people.
Yeah. He's one of the oldest characters.
Spoiler alert,
And,
Batman is Bruce Wayne.
Yeah. That's right. And Batman's origin stories, his parents are killed by this criminal or robber or whatever. And that this sparks revenge, yes, but Batman also seeking after justice. Justice that wasn't able to be handled by the system, and so he takes it into his own hands. To me, what's interesting is, for example, this was horribly portrayed in the movie. But if you did watch the movie Batman versus Superman, this is exactly the point that Batman himself brings up about Superman. Batman's conflict with Superman originates from the idea that Superman, who is basically this godlike deity, exists above and beyond any sort of law or any sort of restriction. And Batman's main point in Batman versus Superman is, yes, Superman is a good guy, quote unquote, but that's just because he agrees with us. What happens when Superman starts to disagree with us? What happens, for example, when Superman doesn't side with the U.S. government? And Batman's issue there is that we can do nothing about it. That Superman is so powerful that he's beyond these traditional restraints. And so Batman feels like he has to do something about it. And that, I think, gets more into the whole, fascism thing.
I mean, that's also fundamentally the disagreement in the character arc between Tony Stark and, Captain America in the MCU, right? That's the fundamental disagreement is, who is going to police our behavior? Who is going to act as some sort of regulatory body for superheroes? Who can check unmitigated power, right? And This is why I said that, contemporary comic books are rather self-conscious about these things. So, I mean, superhero stories emerged around the same time in which fascism emerged. It's roughly in a roughly contiguous time frame. So, it wasn't terribly self-reflective at the time, when the superhero character was first formed or Batman was first formed. But in subsequent decades, people have become much more conscious of this undercurrent of things, and they, within the stories themselves, have put in subtle critiques at various points, posed certain questions, such that I think this comparison to mythology is really good, right? Because early mythological stories about the gods as essentially super powerful human beings, that's more or less what the Greek canon is super powerful human beings, were not terribly nuanced, right? The gods did what out of control, super powerful individuals would do. It wasn't until later on that people started examining these stories and saying, well, these also can be read as a subtle critique of power. And I think that superhero stories act in a similar fashion, right? So you see on display a playing out of what a society giving ultimate power to an individual could look like under a good light and a terrible light. And that's worth considering, especially in a day and age when, essentially the world is becoming more and more controlled by oligarchs, right? The super rich and super powerful. I mean, would we really want to rely on a Jeff Bezos to police the world? Not that many, to my mind, not that many people, or not enough people, would provide a sound critique of why that would be problematic. You see all the advantages of providing superpower to one individual that you trust. They can cut through the red tape. We can get rid of all of this stalemate. They can exact justice in the way that we think is appropriate. So there's all these quote-unquote advantages to doing that. But again, the subtler critique is, what happens when you're on the receiving end of that? What does that look like?
Exactly. You want to jump in, Raymond?
In terms of talking and just laying out the critiques, obviously you have to make the distinction between the early comic books and the more recent iterations, right? The movies we've been talking about. Clearly, the early comic books had fascist themes running throughout because of the time period, right? They were sexist. They were certainly racist to some extent. It's still a major issue today that comic book heroes, superheroes in general, are just white people saving other white people and everyone else, right? Even with, we are starting to see change. Black Panther, made a huge dent in that,
Yeah.
and
Which we're starting
obviously
to see change. But
popularizing.
right.
Which, in fairness, I can hear like comic book fans on the sidelines saying, those characters were created decades ago, and it's not just now that people are making a change under the pressures of like political correctness, right? That those characters were created a long time ago. As a matter of fact, even though this is why this is difficult to talk about. This is because you have all these elements. You have these kind of problematic tendencies towards violence and sexism, but also you could read some comic books as being at the vanguard of social change, like openly gay characters.
Yeah.
X-Men is a great example. Openly gay characters dealing with issues of oppression, what it looks like to be in a minority group. That's essentially the story arc of the X-Men, which is to say, what is it experientially to be a minority, an oppressed minority group. So that's why, we realize these things. We don't want to oversimplify a complex issue, but those issues are still there in some places.
They are, and I'm going to push back on that too, though, because I think the issue is that it's kind of like the more things change, the more they stay the same, right? The comic book world had a reintroduction into society. And many people are disconnected from the history of comic books.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, or even just the genre in itself, I mean, everybody has heard of, Batman and Superman and Spider-Man and all of these things. Nowadays, more than ever, you would really have to be isolated from all of like the global societies of this planet in order to like not hear of at least one superhero. And yet when the reintroduction comes, it always starts with, some 10 introductions to these white superheroes, most of which are male, and it takes a long time, even in what would arguably want to be the most successful movie franchise that's come out in the last 10-15 years, till we get a Black Panther or something like that, right? So it's true they have all this, but they still follow the same patterns of, they're still following in the same patterns that is basically the roots of it all. So I get it, but I also push back on it, because you don't have to follow the historical development of the superheroes, because you're reintroducing them. You could have easily started with, something like a Black Panther or a Wonder Woman, and it wouldn't have mattered at all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it is somewhat telling to say, again, you say, well, this is understandable because these are more well-known characters to begin with, a Iron Man or a Hulk or whatever, a Captain America, Spider-Man, as opposed to beginning with a Captain Marvel or, Black Widow, the movie that we're still waiting on.
Yeah,
right?
we're still waiting on,
they've
yeah.
killed off
Yeah.
the character in the MCU, and she still doesn't have her standalone movie yet after like a decade.
Spoiler, Jared. Jesus.
Sorry. If you're tuning in to this podcast and you have not watched the MCU films, then shame on you. You deserve spoilers.
Yeah. Then don't continue listening. Yeah. And by the way, what rock are you
Yes,
laying on?
I actually asked
Seriously.
students today because I was giving an example, and just to make sure that we were all on the same page, I asked, I was like, "Has everyone seen like the MCU films?" And not a single person had not seen all the MCU. It's one of the last vestiges of monoculture, right?
Yeah.
It's one of the few
Yeah.
things. I would say it's that and Game of Thrones, but I've never watched an episode of Game of Thrones, so I'm outside of the.
Don't even bring up Game of Thrones, or else I'm going to virtually slap you, because I know how you feel about it.
And virtually vomit. No, I don't. Well, I don't know. I did. Game of Thrones is a love-hate.
But we'll talk about Game of Thrones
But
later.
let's talk about.
But getting to,
I was going to
go
say,
ahead.
let's get back to the great things, the interesting things that I think that have really come out of this reintroduction of the superhero world with like the Western world, not Westworld, the Western world, as in like the actual world. The Boys, and then the movie Watchmen,
There you go.
and the way that just flips the whole superhero thing on its head, which I think is important, because you know, we have to get to at some point in this discussion why anybody really cares that superheroes, or superhero movies, to be more precise, in the recent years that we've had this overflow in our culture of superhero movies, could be potentially problematic with all of the quote unquote fascist themes and concepts that they sort of concretize, put out in the world. So, but just to get push back on this idea that the superheroes are fascist, and that we sort of valorize that, because that's the issue, right? We think that Superman is a fascist, but then we love Superman, which is arguably what we're saying is a bad thing. But then you get the boys, and you get the superheroes who are definitely terrible, horrible role models, and these average Joes are combating that. So if you haven't seen that, it's Amazon series. It's an Amazon show, just got released. It's actually really good in terms of flipping it on its head. But The Watchmen is too. It's the same thing. You get this mixed feelings about these incredibly powerful people, and whether or not they're good for everybody or not.
Yeah, I think. I mean, that's kind of the general point that I was trying to bring up before. I think comics are becoming, at least within the past 20 years or so, have become very aware of this problem that we're talking about, the problem of fascism, the problem of authoritarianism, the problem of putting the power to decide life or death in the hands of a single individual. And you see the pushback against that in The Boys and in The Watchmen, which raises the question, like in The Boys, for example, a comic book, a show that's based on the comic book. The superheroes, like Raymond was saying, that the superheroes turn out to be the bad guys. Why are they the bad guys? Not to give too many spoilers away because it's a relatively new show, but they're the bad guys because they operate on their own system of morality unchecked. They can basically do what they want to do. And The Boys does a really good job of showing the implications of what that might look like, which is something that the MCU really hasn't done, at least in terms of the movies. One of the things that bothered some people about the MCU movies, for example, you would have these massive, fantastic battles. For example, in the first Avengers, for the battle for New York, in the Age of Ultron, the battle with Ultron over the city that I can't remember the name of, and then ultimately in Infinity Wars and Endgame, Battle for the Earth. What the movies don't focus on is the amount of collateral damage that would have happened. Now, to Marvel's credit, other Marvel TV shows, like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., does focus on that. But in terms of the major MCU, it's these two superheroes are having a battle, good triumphs over evil, but in terms of the everyday man who suffers from the catastrophic consequences of this superhuman battle, their life is in shambles, which I think is the perfect analogy, for example, with war, with the clash of authoritarian powers. So, for example, the clash of governments, the clash of dictators. Yeah, you might have the triumph of one dictator over the other, but at what cost? What people don't read about, well, I think now, to be clear, historians have done a fantastic job of this. But so, for example, let's go back to World War II. World War II, if there ever was a war about good versus evil, right, you don't get much more evil than the Nazis. At least I don't think. So World War II is oftentimes presented as this epic struggle between good and evil, between the Allied powers and the Nazis. Fair enough. But by forming such a narrative, what you leave out is the amount of death and destruction experienced by the average, everyday Joe Blow in wake of the clash between these two superpowers, which I think is one of the points we're trying to make here.
Yeah, I do want to push back a little because I do. I think that Civil War, to the MCU's credit, was they did a good job, I think, to some extent. They probably could have made it a little bit more explicit, but the entire struggle between Tony Stark and Captain America was over whether or not they should be they should be following the orders of a democratically elected government, right? So there was that tension, and that's ultimately, I think, what the whole question was about. The whole movie
And let
was
me
about.
walk it back just a little bit, because I think that's a really good point. And I've actually read the Civil War comic, and the comic itself does a fantastic job of bringing that point out. So yeah, I mean,
Exceptions
yes,
to the rule,
again,
right?
you're right about that. One of the starting point of the Civil War is, yeah, anyway. Jared, you kind of jumped in on the conversation, but
Yeah, I had to step away and be a father for a moment.
unacceptable. Podcast comes in.
No, so just hearing the tail end of that, did you mention, of course, that the driving force behind the story in Civil War is essentially the events of one of the previous Avenger films, right? Wherein, okay, so just so that's covered, that they deal with, even in kind of a, not a super in-depth way, I think, but it is mentioned like the ramifications of these sorts of battles, that they impact real people's lives, and that's generative of additional problems, right? So these don't just go away. There's resentments that are harbored and all those things.
Yeah, and to further elaborate on that, in the comic, the spoiler alert for the comic, but in the comic, Civil War starts off because there is this TV show being made about some of the younger superheroes to kind of hype them up and to kind of show like how great of people they are. And in one of the episodes, it goes wrong. Like it goes downhill really fast when one of the villains, who has the power to blows himself up and kills all these people, which airs. And so the dilemma after that was like, what just happened? Like, we've got to do something. So it's a bit different from the movie, but the general idea that, perhaps these superheroes ought to be regulated by some higher order other than their own sense of self-justice or whatever.
And I think that the most salient critique of the superhero genre that I'm familiar with, and maybe there are other ones out there that people more familiar with comic books could tell me about, but really The Watchmen, I read as a massive critique of the entire genre of superheroes. And it's really, if you have a character like I'm blanking on the character's name. Dr. Manhattan. So if you have a character like Dr. Manhattan who is imbued with all of these powers, then the natural question is, why would he fight for truth, justice, in the American way, right? Why would he be so very parochial? And you see that come to the fore. It's actually something similar goes on in, this is going to be a stretch, but I'm going to come back to it. In Lord of the Rings, right, Tolkien thought for a long time about what are the implications of a society of immortals, right? Like, what sort of values would that society have? What would motivate that society to engage in, say, the wars of men or something like that? And I think that there's something similar going on with respect to a Dr. Manhattan or a Superman character. What do you do with someone who is so far beyond human capacities? Why would they treat that power responsibly? And I think that is the one real danger, and I don't think that it's a danger which is created by superheroes at all. I think that it's a manifestation of this, which is, in the face of power, I think that we're too trusting. And we tend to, most people tend to assume that those in power have our best interest in mind. They may not always act upon it correctly, and of course there's corruption here and there, but basically power itself is treated as a neutral category in terms of value. Whereas I personally see power as an inherently corrupting thing. I see power as a very dangerous quality, and so most people need to have it in restricted senses, right? Because you can't trust people with absolute power, because even the best of people can be corrupted by it. And I see both tendencies in comic books. This kind of Pollyannish naivete in the face of absolute power, and then also correspondingly a critique of what it would mean to give over ourselves to an all-powerful entity. So I don't know.
No, I think that's
It's
a good
more
point.
than its fair share of politics there, but
Yeah. I think that brings up an interesting point, which is to say, why does anybody really care about whether or not superheroes are fascist or ideal forms of, democracy or something like that? And I think that is really what drives this constant discussion about fascism in connection to the superhero genre. And it's really just this concern that, life imitates art, and that sort of circular influence that art and life have, which is that you watch enough, superheroes on TV in a decade, and then that's what you look for, and you strive to like realize in your daily life, and you give up a lot of the responsibilities or the hard work that it takes to be like genuinely democratic in a society or something like that.
Yeah. And there are some really good parallels, speaking to that point, about how comic books bring up that. There's some excellent parallels in recent comics. What immediately comes to mind for me is in the DC is the Injustice series that it's based on the video game, but is also a series of comics, as well as kind of Captain America's recent story arc, for example, in Winter Soldier. Both series bring up this question where certain characters in Injustice, this is represented by Superman. In Captain America Winter Soldier, this is actually, it's not an analogy or anything, it's just flat out represented by the U.S. government. What happens when these institutions or these people in which we have given up some of our own freedom, we have given up some of our own individuality and entrusted it to these people or to these organizations, what happens when we can no longer hold them responsible for their actions? And so at the heart of some of these storylines is precisely this question that, Raymond, that you and Jared just raised, this problem. Should we trust people in power? And how much should we trust these people in power?
Yeah. And it's interesting because, the Civil War, the Avengers Civil War movie, the shallow understanding of that is that it really just follows the sort of, you don't expect the Tony Stark billionaire, I'm not going to give up my weapon, I've privatized world peace, right? That whole line from the Ironman movies, to be on board
Yeah.
with basically taking orders from the U.S. government or some, national organization, international organization like that. And then on the opposite side of that, you have the soldier who came from nothing, Captain America, who then becomes, uncomfortable with this. But it actually kind of expresses their tension quite nicely, because
Yeah.
he is the elite, rich, gold spoon, silver spoon in your mouth kid, Tony Stark, who then is, automatically inducted into the highest echelons of an oligarchy or a government, right? I mean, it didn't matter if he was a superhero or not. He was still a superhero,
Right.
regardless of his suit. He was just kind of an asshole. And he, but he was still a superhero. I mean, he
Yeah.
created weapons of mass destruction, and he helped people in the military. They were all very fascinated with him. You see it in the movie as they, lay it out. And then it just becomes something that he privatizes even more. But then on the other hand, you have the hyper individualism of Captain America, right? Who doesn't want to give over to that.
Yes.
So it's this weird inversion.
Yes.
I I think it was successful in the way that they represented it, but obviously you get so
Uh-huh.
caught up in the action aspect of those movies that you miss a lot of that struggle. But that's what it is. It's basically saying you have this
Yeah.
individualist who's got power, comes from nothing, right? And it's not a power that is
Mm-hmm.
given to him through circumstance, um, as much as it is, compiled. It's so I guess it is to some extent, but it's really the essence of who he is then just magnified times 1,000, right? And that's who Captain America is. Whereas, the Tony Stark figure is, if you had the right smart person in his situation with affluence, good education, and as much money as you could possibly throw at them, then yeah, almost anybody could do what he does, right? In fact, we see that because many people put on the
Mm-hmm.
suit in the Iron Man series. It's not just Tony Stark. So it's a weird tension there.
Exactly.
They play with a lot of that stuff, but
Exactly.
I don't know, it doesn't necessarily always bleed through in the way that I think they hope, because of all the special effects they wind into it and the limits of an hour and a half to 2 hour movie.
Right. Yeah, it's just a pretty movie, and it's just fun to watch those superheroes punch each other in the face. I mean, part of that is what it boils down to. But that's why I like Captain America as a character in terms of like character development. He has one of my favorite arcs because you see it taken from the first Captain America movie, going through Civil War and Winter Soldier especially. Captain America, as the name suggests, is supposed to embody American ideals. This is why I like to talk about comic books in terms of mythology, because Captain America represents what many people consider to be like American ideals, especially during like the golden age of American history, especially during like World War II. I mean, obviously, I call it myth because if you look at the actual history, it's a lot messier. But if you take his character as myth, and if you take what that era represents in terms of its mythology, in terms of what it was trying to represent, you have that individualism, the emphasis on the pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, the individual being able to overcome whatever odds is thrown at him, and the firm belief that power, those in power, are looking out for your best interest, and if you just be a good person, eventually you'll make it in the world. Kind of the American dream. And it contrasts that with Captain America in the later films. Captain America in Winter Soldier, Captain America in Civil War, who becomes disillusioned by the ideals that he's supposed to embody because he starts to realize that the America he inhabits doesn't live up to the myth. And that, in fact, it's much different. And that those values he held are not held by those in power.
Yeah. And the final thing that I think really drives some of the tension with Captain America's character, as much as he is definitely the like American ideal, right? But in terms of not being on the slippery slope of fascism, which I still think is, always a possibility for him, it comes because that's a reality for his character, because they don't, as far as the movies go, I'm not as familiar with the comic book, so I can't speak to that. But there's a question about empowering the powerless, um, within, like what we would consider an anti-fascist world. You can be selfless, you can sacrifice, you can protect people, but if you're not empowering them in some way, in like a legitimate, concrete way, then it begs the question as to whether or not one day you won't just be on the other side of history, right? You can always, be a good person or fit the norms or the morals of a certain society at any given moment. But if you're not attempting to empower people so that they can, find their own way through life, then ultimately time eventually will betray you and you'll become the antecedent to what everybody thought was ideal and good at some point. And I don't know what Captain America offers in the way of empowering people.
Well, I would say one thing about the film is why is Steve Rogers selected for the Super Soldier program in the first place? Like in the film at least, they say you were selected because you know what it's like to be a weak person, right? If you were to give great power to a powerful person, they would abuse it. They wouldn't understand because they haven't grown up with the sense of empathy, right? The strength of the Captain America character, at least within the MCU, is the empathy that he has for the powerless. And it's made explicit in the film that the reason why he has that empathy is because he grew up as a powerless person. I mean, he had the strength of character, but he was a physically weak person who was abused by the powerful. And so when he is given great power, he uses it, or at least supposedly, he uses it for the purpose of empowering the powerless.
Which is a huge draw for us in terms of his character, and not to get overtly political about it, but that seems to be the draw to a lot of current political candidates too. Well, they're not politicians, and that's what draws people to these political candidates. They haven't been corrupted. They haven't been. They're not part of the system.
Well, and again, I think it's good for you to point that out here because, again, to me, the issue with power is its corrupting influence. So we want to give power to people that we trust because we say, you won't be corrupted by this power. When in point of fact, I think that we should be restricting the amount of power that any one individual has for the very corrupting influence that power itself conveys. In other words, we say, well, we want someone that looks like us because we can trust them, and we'll give them all of the power because we can't trust everyone else. But in that process, in that transfer, you are detaching them from the social setting which made them the person that they are, and in some respects, they can become just as destructive, or perhaps even more destructive, than the elite class because we don't expect it of them, right? Look at any strongman. Any strongman casts himself as the advocate of the people, right? So populists. I mean, look at Adolf Hitler, right? He came from essentially nothing. Benito Mussolini was not really an elite. Franco, and then if you look at contemporary people, look at a Donald Trump, for example. Even though he's manifestly nothing like the vast majority of people in this country, he, for whatever reason, certain people within the working class can see that they project onto him their values, even if he is not actually a reflection of those values. They project those values onto him and they say, well, he's one of us. Because that becomes the motivation for giving him all the power is he's one of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good point, and not to keep using comic book examples, but if you've seen any of the Netflix Marvel shows, Daredevil, Luke Cage, Iron Fist, Jessica Jones, I just watched the third season of Jessica Jones. Well, actually, I'm still watching the third season of Jessica Jones, and this is one of the central conflicts of the third season. Is you have Jessica Jones, who's a superhero, superpowered, and you have her close female friend whose name is Trish, who starts off as a regular human, but who eventually gains superpowers, and she wants to gain superpowers. And before she becomes superpowered, she has all of these ideals, and she refers to herself as Jessica's moral compass. But what you see happen over the course of the season is that once she gets power, her strong sense of morality that she has, it quickly starts to dissolve, and she's doing things that she didn't really imagine herself to be capable of. So this idea of being present there, one of the main conflicts of that third season is the idea that power itself is corrupting. can't corrupt you.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. This is why I think that the democratic process, whatever its shortcomings, should be seen as the ideal, because essentially what you're doing is diffusing that power amongst a lot of different individuals. So despite their tendencies towards corruption, it's limiting the scope of what you can do with that corruption. It doesn't change human nature, right? Human beings have the same flaws and tendencies. It's just you're amplifying people's ability to do good and ill when you give them lots of power. And then the tendency today is to muddle the terrible things that you do by engaging in philanthropy, right? So you have, like, the Koch brothers, for example, right? They have done tremendous harm to the world, to our political system, to the environment, but they have these foundations which dump money into things like, public radio, for example. That doesn't absolve any of the terrible things that they're doing, right? But a lot of people treat it as though it's kind of an exchange, right? So I'll deposit a lot in the social good, and then I can withdraw, right, some of my vices, such that whenever I'm called out for doing terrible, heinous things, I can always fall back on, well, but look at all of these good things that you wouldn't have if it wasn't for me. So again, it's just I have a real distaste for the very idea that we should be giving lots of power to individuals. Especially in the manners in which we go about justifying why they have that power. And again, to bring this back to the topic, it's the same thing with superheroes, right? Well, you say, well, they do terrible things, and there are terrible consequences to their actions. But you say, well, look at all of the good things that they do. Okay, but this isn't like a counterbalance, right? Anyway.
Exactly.
So, Jared, are you saying you're anti superheroes? I'm gonna put you in a corner there so that if Reddit comes after us, they'll target you.
Yeah, that's blocking. I'm not against all notions of superheroes. I think there's a lot of values. People find strength in kind of the voyeurism of it, especially if you are. So if you grew up in the 1980s as a black kid reading Black Panther, that could feel empowering, right? Because here in Wakanda you have a society that doesn't have all of the racial inequalities of contemporary United States. Or if you're a young girl reading Captain Marvel, or if you are kind of just an odd kid reading the X-Men, right? Or a gay kid reading the X-Men, I can see where just the voyeurism of saying that here's someone I can identify with. I think there's a lot of value to that. I grew up reading X-Men. That was the main comic book that I read when I was a kid, and I still enjoy the X-Men. I still enjoy the MCU films, even though the level of comic book fandom these days, if you say you're a comic book fan,
oh yeah, y'all need to get on
there's
my
definitely
level.
levels to this. I am not at the level. Yeah, I am not at the level of most comic book fans. So I don't want to categorically say I'm against superheroes, but I do think that voyeurism has some limits. And those limits come down to things like what are the values which are being portrayed? And this sort of escapism of comic books is fine to some degree until it becomes and again, I'm not blaming comic books for the contemporary situation. What I'm saying more or less is comic books are a manifestation of the situation, these same impulses, right? What you see reflected in comic books in the early stages is a naive approach to power. But then in the intervening decades, right? So when Superman comes out in an unironic way and says, I'm for truth, justice, and the American way, and I do that by beating up people, right? That's reflective of the values of the society. It didn't create those values; it just reflects them. Post Watergate, post Vietnam, post scandal upon scandal upon scandal, you see reflected, you see reflected in the comic books of those generations more ambivalence towards those ideals, towards those powers, in an unironic way. And then I think these days, when we have so much kind of naive cynicism about the world, it's almost refreshing to watch a Captain America and say that there are some people who still value traditional things like truth and justice. And it's not, and this is important, I think, with regards to the character arc of Steve Rogers. He begins kind of with this wide-eyed idealist. Then he becomes disillusioned, right? He becomes disillusioned because he sees the real world. But he's not running away from those values. He just realizes that the world no longer, or maybe never, reflected the values that he held sacred. But his response to that is not to become a nihilist. His response is to say, I am, in the face of opposition, going to live out these values in the world. And I think that is a really strong response to kind of the hopelessness of the current moment, as I said, the cynicism of the moment. Because the tendency of a lot of people today is just to say the world is irredeemably corrupt. There's nothing we can do, so why bother? And I feel like that's a cop-out. And if you're only getting the values of resistance to tyranny from comic books, in the person of certain characters, right? Then at least you're getting it somewhere.
I think that's a really good point that you brought up, Jared, and it reminds me a lot. I know that you've seen it because we've talked about it before, but there is an essay by David Foster Wallace on sincerity, I think it is. And David Foster Wallace, author of the book Infinite Jest, was also a bit of a cultural critic, and he was a cultural critic. And one of the things that he pointed out that he was observing in media, and this was late 90s, early 2000s, I think it was, is we have, if we're talking about the impact of culture and philosophy and culture, vice versa, we are feeling the impact of postmodernity. And one of the overarching ideas of postmodernism is a destruction and a critique of narrative, of any sort of overarching values or metaphysics or anything like that. And what David Foster Wallace points out is that this is reflected in our TV shows and in our art. And you see this, he liked to talk about TV shows, but you see this in comics as well, that character arc that Jared just talked about. Captain America starting off as this idealist, believing in American values. David Foster Wallace sees this reflected in 80s and early 90s TV shows. And then you start to have this shift towards, I think, nihilism, right?
Yeah. Ironic detachment, I think, is what he talks about, but it's essentially like
Yes.
you never see values portrayed on shows in a sincere way. If anything, you see the person with values is typically seen as kind of a patsy. They're the rube that always falls for everything. They're overly sentimental and naive. And so what Wallace is pointing towards is a move towards a new sincerity, right? A new move towards sincerity, wherein it's kind of a second order phenomenon related to postmodernity. That by the time this gets disseminated into the culture, it looks different than the actual critiques of like a Baudrillard or something like that. But the way that it manifests itself is in kind of this ironic detachment and a distrusting of values. But what you're starting to see, at least at the fringes of some of this is a kind of a return not to wide-eyed idealism, right? This naive values about the world, but just saying, well, look, the world is the way that it is, and what do we do in the face of it? We can either do nothing and become nihilists and just say, to hell, really more fatalist than nihilist, right? We can be fatalists about the state of the world, or we could do something. And it's not because we think necessarily that we're going to change the world, but because in opposing ourselves to the negative values of the powerful, we show them who we are as individuals. We are able to live out our values not because we expect that that's what the world thinks that is natural, but because that's how we're choosing to live as embodied experiential creatures in the world.
Yeah, which I think is perfectly represented by Captain America and his story arc. Especially you see it in Endgame where, again, not to spoil the movie, but where he goes back to meet his former self that is full of these ideals that his current self has not really rejected, but has seen that has seen them as ideals, as they are.
It's more complicated than that.
There's a lot of gray area there. But Captain America at the end of it still stands for something. He's not like
He's still a stalwart character. Yeah, and I think that's, again, refreshing in this day and age of kind of moral relativism. Yeah. And by that I mean, kind of a wishy-washiness about, like, it's not that people don't even claim to have values, it's that people seem to do whatever is easiest and most convenient. People don't seem in, popular representations of things to take risks for the sake of their character, things like that.
I know we're running out of time, but I definitely want to just point out that I feel like Black Panther escapes all of these critiques.
ooh, well, don't just leave us with that. Explain it.
We may need. We may need to do an episode. All right, can you do it in like 2 or 3 minutes?
Let's do an episode on Black Panther. Yes,
I could get behind an entire episode of.
Love it.
I think we should do it. No, we should do an episode on the Earth because it deals with an entirely separate form. I mean, fascism is joined at the hip to democracy.
No, that's a great idea.
Wakanda is a monarchy and a peaceful, forward-thinking one. So it doesn't apply to. I just wanted to throw that out there because I didn't want it to get lumped into all of the other ones, and it just turns me back onto this sentiment that Black culture in America will lead the way to our salvation. And I think Wakanda definitely fits that bill. So,
amen to that. No, and plus Killmonger is probably one of the best villains in the entire MCU, hands down.
Yes, absolutely, by far, because him and Thanos are good, complex characters that are really worth discussing, and I think that Killmonger is even a more complex and interesting character than Thanos. So we can definitely talk about that for a while. So, any final comment?
nah, I mean, when you're watching these movies, and just keep in mind that these are supposed to be ideals that we as a culture want to represent. I think that that's the key takeaway. Not that we want to find that one person who we can just pass on the responsibility to.
I would say for my final comment, this is an unrelated quote, but Daniel Dennett once said that there's no such thing as philosophy-free science. I would say that there's no such thing as philosophy-free art either. And that whatever form of art, whether it's a movie or painting or literature or comic book, whatever form of art you're reading or consuming, there is philosophical ideas that are lying underneath. So be aware of that. for good or ill.
All right. Well, I think that pretty much does it. Thanks for joining us for this episode. We'll see you next time.
Peace.